and see if we can answer some of your queries. So welcome to our first ever live streamed marine event, Diving into the Irish Sea. I'm Lucy and this is Danny.
Hi.
And we are the Marine Futures Interns for the North West Wildlife Trust, so for Cumbria Wildlife Trust as well. Over the next hour, we'll be exploring a whole range of different marine and coastal habitats and some of the fantastic wildlife who lives there, as well as diving a bit deeper into some of the species maybe we don't see from the shore, but which come and visit our seas. As I said earlier, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll try to come back to them. And for now, I'll hand over to Danny.
So over the last month, we've been travelling all around Cumbria's coastline to bring you some of the best marine life around the Irish Sea. So first up, we're going rock pooling to the Cumbria Coast Marine Conservation Zone, or as you might know it, St Bees Head.
So we're here at the cliffs at St Bees Head on the westerlymost point of Cumbria. And behind me is one of the best examples of intertidal rocky habitat in the county. This is a really important habitat for loads of wildlife like crabs, anemones and starfish. And what we're going to do today is head out in the rock pools and see what we can find. So these little creatures we found clasped to the rock here are limpets. These are really important ecosystem engineers. They're basically these tiny little sea snails, and when the tide comes in, they'll unclasp from the rock and go off grazing around all this seaweed. And what they do is they keep the seaweed at bay and stop any one species from taking over, allowing loads of other organisms space to thrive.
Rock pools are an amazing window into marine ecology. Just bring your curiosity, come in and have a look. And if you look around, you will see loads of different species that are adapted to living in really changeable conditions. So when the tide goes out, they'll be exposed to wind and weather, and when it comes in, they'll be pounded by waves. So the rock pools here and the boulders provide a really important sheltering habitat for them. So this really pretty pink seaweed here, with all the white dots on it, is called corallina. It's a seaweed which is really filled with calcium, which makes it harder for things to eat, thus protecting it.
So this amazing seaweed here is called bladderwrack. And one of the things that's really special about it is it's full of these little pockets of air which help it float up to the surface and make the most of the light, and also make it a really important habitat for small fish and for predators who are hiding in it to hunt.
Inside these little holes has built up this reef around it to protect it from predators. Now this creates a really important habitat because of all the crevices that it makes that other species can use. So these areas will have a lot more wildlife than bare rock.
So what we've got in here is some tiny baby blue mussels. And these are little filter feeders that clasp onto any hard surface like a rock or a pier and then filter the water and grab all the nutrients from it. So quite often you'll find them in kind of vast swathes on intertidal rocks. But what we've got here is obviously some little baby ones that have found a bit of shelter to grab onto. So this rock here has loads of different anemones on. There's a few that we're pretty sure are beadlets, but there's also a couple that might be snake-lock anemones or strawberry anemones.
So we also have a very small
I understand you had some issues with the sound quality there, so sorry about that. Hopefully that'll improve with the other videos through the event, but always keep telling us how it is and we'll do our best to make it as accessible as possible with the sound. That was a really great diversity of marine life we saw there.
Yeah, so rock pools are great windows into marine life. So the boulders and the rock pools that we find there are fantastic areas to provide shelter in really harsh conditions. So the intertidal zone between the high and low tide is subject to periods underwater, periods out of the water, crashing waves, sun, wind, you name it. The species that live there have to shelter from all these conditions. So the fragile organisms will often be underneath of the rocks, so you often have to lift them up to see them. And the rocks also provide a really great surface for creatures to attach to. So we saw lots of seaweeds there, and these marine algae are really important. So they'll photosynthesize and they'll add oxygen to the water. There'll be a food for species to eat, and other species can hide in them and protect themselves from these harsh conditions and from predators. And it was low tide while we were there, but at high tide, when the water comes in, the rock pools will come to life. So the barnacles and the anemones will extend their tentacles out and they'll grab food from the water. And the crabs and the fish will all come out and they'll start hunting and feeding around as well.
Amazing. So what is it that makes St. Bees specifically so important?
So St. Bees is one of the best and most extensive examples of intertidal rock pool habitats that we have on the predominantly sedimentary northwest coast. And these cave-like conditions allow unusual algae to thrive. They allow mobile organisms such as crabs and sea snails and brittle stars, which can all shelter amongst really colourful, beautiful sponges.
Amazing. So are there any species which maybe we didn't see when we were there at St. Bees, but which are common in the rock pools along our coast?
Yeah, so we didn't see any fish on that day, but you'll quite often get fish which are specifically adapted to rock pool environments. So things like shanies or blennies, which can survive out of the water, and they'll use the moisture that's around these rocks to help them survive during low tide. We also didn't see any starfish there, but you'll often see lots of brittle stars or cushion stars, other starfish that are typically found in rock pools. And then, of course, you get the crabs, so things like the common shore crab or the edible crab, so the crab that's named because the edge of its shell looks like a pie crust. Or common prawns, things like that. You never know what you'll find. Every day is a new adventure. So we've had reports even of a baby octopus that was found in one of the rock pools near Blackpool. So keep your eyes out and see what you can find.
That's so cool, so exciting. So all of these species are kind of intertidal, meaning they live between the area of the high tide and the low tide. But are there any similar species, maybe related species, which we find just in the subtidal zone?
Yeah, so the subtidal zone, the zone just below the tide mark, we'll find things like the ross worm, so similar to the honeycomb worm, which build up these reefs made out of sand and shells. You have similar things in the subtidal zone, which do a very similar thing and are vitally important for wildlife there. We also saw the periwinkles there, and we'll have lots more shells that are below the subtidal zone. So things like the huge whelk shells, which are 3 times larger and whose shell is a favourite for hermit crabs to use. And then we also saw the mussels there. So we saw a few fairly small patches of them. But if you go to south of Walney, there can be huge beds that are over hundreds of square metres wide of these mussels that are feeding in the water there.
Fantastic. And if people want to go out rock pooling themselves, what kind of things do they need to consider?
Well, you always have to be careful of the tide, so look at your tide times. You want to be going just before low tide, and be careful because it can be really easy to have your head in a rock pool getting all excited and not see that the tide is coming up around you. So be careful of that. Watch out for slippery surfaces. Lots of the rocks can be covered with algae, which can make them very slippery while you're walking over them. And it's really important that you lift the rocks carefully. So a lot of the organisms that are underneath are very fragile, and some of them even have territory. So it's important that you place them back gently and that you put them back where you found them.
Thanks, Danny. Now, if rock pooling isn't your cup of tea, but you'd like another way to go and explore the marine environment, then one of our favourite ways to spend a sunny afternoon is to head to the sand and go looking for seashells. You might want to, those of you who said the music was too loud, you might want to just turn your own volume down a little bit on this one, because I think the videos do play louder than our speaking. But this is a quick clip of what Danny and I found when we headed to Sandscale Hawes on the Duddon estuary.
Hi, so we've come to Sandscale Hawes today. So as you can see, we've got a lovely bay of intertidal mudflats behind us. And we've also got the beautiful Lake District Hills in the distance. So these areas provide a really great place for mollusks and for worms within the mud. And because of this, you also get lots and lots of wading birds which come here to feed on all that energetic food here. So we're going to go out, we're going to see what shells we can find to give us an idea of what mollusks are in the Irish Sea.
We've just finished our first sweep of the beach and we've brought back all kinds of interesting shells to have a look at. There's some scallops here, some different types of gastropods and mollusks, and we're going to have a look at each of these individually. This species here is a variegated scallop. So these are amazing little mollusks that live on the seabed, and when a predator comes along they can open and close their shells to swim away. Now they tend to live further out in sea, but they'll have washed up once they've died, and that's why some of these are a little bit broken.
So this here is a razor clam, and it's a really great example of a bivalve. So you can see it has two shells which are hinged together in the middle. And razor clams will be below here in their thousands. They have a really big foot which allows them to disappear down deep into the sand in seconds. And then when the high tide comes in, they will go towards the surface and extend a siphon out which allows them to breathe and feed in the water.
These tiny little bivalves are called thin talons. So these are filter feeders and they live buried down in the mud out in the estuary. You tend to find them in sort of pinks and yellows, and they're really small. They don't tend to grow more than 2 or 3 centimetres. Watch out when you're walking around because these will break really, really easily. Now we have records of native oysters being fished in the UK since Roman times. And in the 1800s they were super abundant all around our coast, especially in estuaries like this. However, due to overfishing, they've actually become locally extinct and we don't find them anymore in the Irish Sea. What we do find is their shells, which have become worn over the years in the sand and are now lovely and smooth. Now, a few different marine mollusks drill into shells and rocks in order to get some really important nutrients and also have a place to hide for protection. So this could be from a necklace shell, it could be from a boring piddock, or it could be from a few different creatures.
So these shells come from a snail which you might find within the mud in the bay here. And they're called tower shells, or you might also hear them called auger shells. This is because their really tall shape looks like a drill. So these are otter shells, and these are one of the bigger shells that you'll find. So they can grow up to 14 centimetres across. And you'll find them in their thousands around this estuary, sometimes even poking out of the mud.
So one of the most abundant shells in this estuary are cockles. There's a few different types of cockles, but the most common in this area are the prickly cockle and the common cockle. The way you tell them apart is that the prickly cockle is often larger, it's often got more kind of brown colouring, and the ridges are thicker and wider spaced. Sometimes it'll have these kind of prickly spines along it, though these are often worn down because of the sand. The common cockle by comparison is usually paler, it's much smaller, and the ridges are smoother and less defined.
So as you can see, some of the shells that we find look very similar. So it's really useful to carry an ID book with you to just check back on what you've got. So we've got the peppery furrow shell, we've got a thick trough shell, and we've got a rayed trough. So these are all filter feeders that we'll find buried in the mud.
Another thing we've found quite a few of are these whelk shells. So whelks are large sea snails that go out grazing in the subtidal zone, and their shells are a favourite for hermit crabs who quite often use them as their second home. Now some of these shells have become buried in the sand, and because there's no oxygen down there, they're stained black. So this can make the ID quite confusing because we can't really rely on things like colour. Now all mollusks have some kind of shell, but sometimes that's a much reduced or internal shell, such as this. This is the cuttlebone, which is the internal shell of a cuttlefish, which we find loads of out in the Irish Sea. So sandy habitats are really important for cuttlefish because they dig into the sand to catch all kinds of prey that's buried in there, such as sand eels and other small fish. We hope you enjoyed learning about all of the marine animals that live in this sediment.
Thanks for joining us on our seashell adventure. So thanks for keep telling us what you find. So Julia has just told us that she's seen a dog shark while she was rock crawling. Dogfish, sorry, while she was rock crawling, which is fantastic. So keep sending us your sightings. So back to the beach combing. So Lucy, why do these animals have shells and how do they make them?
Well, all these mollusks are invertebrates, meaning they have no internal skeleton, and so they need some kind of external structure to help support their soft muscular bodies and give them some protection from predators or from the elements. They build these shells by secreting calcium carbonate, which is the same compound you find in limestone. So it's really, really tough as a material. And much like a tree, they grow a new ring on their shell each year. So we can actually use the shells themselves to age roughly how old the creature was. This is how we found out that the ocean quahog, which is a type of bivalve, which are those hinged shells that we saw in the video, was actually over 500 years old and is the oldest known creature in the whole world.
Wow, isn't that exciting? So we saw lots of different species there. Can you tell us a bit more about them and how they live and how the shells help them survive?
Yeah, of course. So many of these mollusks use their shells in different ways. For the cuttlefish, which we mentioned, their cuttlebone is the internal structure to help them kind of have some rigidity, and then they use their strong muscular bodies to swim around and hunt for different creatures. By comparison, the bivalves use the kind of solid structure provided by their shells to latch onto rocks or to be able to draw water in and out of their bodies and filter out all the nutrients. And the gastropods, which are the little sea snails that we saw, they use them as protection while they're grazing about to help protect them from predators. But also, when the tide goes out, they can create a really good seal on the rock and use their shell to help stop them being dehydrated by the sun and the wind and help keep their bodies nice and moist.
Wow, so why are these animals important? Why should we care about them?
Well, in estuaries like the Duddon, the invertebrate life is a really, really important food source for loads of wading birds. Birds like curlews and oyster catchers and grey plovers will come all the way over from their Arctic breeding grounds to the UK, where they spend the whole winter feasting on this invertebrate life to build up lots of nice body fat to then allow them to migrate back again. And these bivalves and gastropods also provide loads of what we call ecosystem services. So this is things like by filtering out excess nutrients, they improve the water quality. They also help slow erosion because there's so many of them in the sand and in the mud. And the kind of grazing species like the sea snails help to create loads of more space on the rocks or on the mud, which allows other organisms space to thrive, so no one species is dominating. And then on top of all of that, if you kind of farm it, harvest it sustainably at a fairly small scale, and enough is left for the rest of the wildlife, then shellfish especially are actually a really great source of low carbon, sustainable protein for humans too. So they're really just all round great species.
Brilliant. So if somebody wants to go beachcombing, what will your top tips be?
Well, much like with the rock pooling, it's really important to check the tides. Even if you're just on the beach, the section you're on might get cut off by the tide and you might not be able to get back to where you started. So that's definitely a first. It's also always a great idea to bring an ID book with you. The seashells themselves play a really important role in the ecosystem. So species like hermit crabs kind of use the old shells as their external protection. Also, loads of species use the hard surface created by the shells to kind of grow on. So things like barnacles, anemones, and seaweeds can quite often be seen growing on other shells. And as the shells break down, they become the sediment that we find on the beach. So if you go taking away all the shells, then they can't provide that wonderful role in the ecosystem. So if you bring your ID book, take some photos, and sort of investigate it all on the beach, then leave the shells there, that's a much more sustainable way of doing things. And finally, while you're there, it's always a great idea to keep an eye out for any marine litter you might see, pick that up and do your bit to help keep our coastal habitats clean.
Yes, definitely.
Now, if you venture just a few miles up the coast from St. Bees, you'll reach Fleswick Bay, which is a really good example of a coastal inlet where the beach stretches out under the cliffs and the tide washes in all kinds of marine debris, which we can use to find out a bit more about what's going on under the waves. You might want to turn your volume down a little bit again, because I know some of you are having issues with the sound on the videos. But here's what happened when we went for a strandline search. Is they really give us a bit of an insight into what's going on in the sea. You can identify all kinds of organisms from their remains that wash upon the shore that we otherwise might not know are around unless we went into the water.
So these are whelk eggs, and they come from the largest sea snail in the UK, the common whelk. Common whelks lay up to 2,000 eggs in big clusters that look a bit like a ball of bubble wrap. Each bubble would have contained hundreds of tiny eggs. By the time we see them, the eggs have often hatched and they're empty with a pale and papery appearance. But occasionally you may see them with more of a yellow and orange colour, and these may have live eggs inside.
So one of the things we found loads of today is mermaids' purses. So these are the egg cases of sharks, which are these sort of longer rectangular ones, and also skates, which are generally these sort of pointier horned ones.
Of the skates, we found 11 egg cases from the thornback ray, which is one of the most commonly encountered skates in the UK. We also found one egg case from the spotted ray, which is much smaller. Their egg cases are much more elongated. They have no keels at the side, and they have a longer, more rectangular shape and a smoother appearance. In terms of sharks, we found an enormous 20 egg cases from the small spotted cat shark, or as you may know it, the rock salmon or lesser spotted dogfish. Their egg cases are pale yellow, around 5 centimetres long, and have beautiful curly tendrils at the end.
So the way that these work is the long curly tendrils wrap themselves around the seaweed so the egg case will stay anchored there nice and safe and won't get washed out to sea. We found loads of different types of seaweed here too today, showing the kind of diversity we have in this area. Danny?
Yeah, so we found some of the common bladderwrack that you'll find along the place, so you can easily identify it by the big air sacs that it has, which helps it float in the water. We've also got some kelp that you might find from some of the kelp beds around in the Irish Sea. This really thick, big frond of seaweed. We also found some carheen seaweed, so this one is more frilled and fronded at the end. We've also got some hornwrack, so this might look like a seaweed, but it's actually a colony of lots of tiny little animals which all join together into this kind of seaweed-like structure.
Unfortunately, not everything we find on the strandline search is necessarily exciting. We also find a lot of traces of humans. So this here is some kind of polystyrene sponge, some what looks like kind of fishing line, and also a bit of rope. And these really show sort of how much marine litter there is in the environment, and also how chances are if there's a beach near you, you could go out collecting some of this litter, use it for some arts and crafts projects, and really make a difference to the marine environment.
Wow, isn't it fascinating how these little cute clues in the strandline tell us more about what's out in the Irish Sea?
Absolutely. There's loads of things we can kind of determine from those traces that we got on the strandline that we otherwise wouldn't know about the marine habitats. For example, the kelp forest. So we quite often find kelp washed up along the shore in Cumbria, and this grows in vast forests out in the deeper offshore waters, up to about 50 metres deep, where it can still catch loads of sunlight and its leaves and create all kinds of amazing habitats for different creatures like blue-rayed limpets who live on the leaves themselves, sea urchins and stalked jellyfish that use the holdfast, which is the kind of anchor point where the kelp attaches to the seabed, and they use the shelter of that to grow, and you get a whole little microclimate there. And then because there's so many other species there, it attracts large predators like our grey seals or different kind of shark species that come and hunt in that habitat too. Another really great thing we can see is from the species that are there, we can guess what other species we might see based on what eat them. For example, the hornwrack is a lovely little colonial creature. It looks a little bit like a seaweed, but it's actually the little colony as Danny described in the video. And the species who feed on that are things like sea snails, sea slugs, and even sea spiders. So though we quite often wouldn't find them washed up on the shore, the fact that the hornwrack's there means that we know the species that will feed on them will be there too.
Wow, we saw loads of mermaids' purses there. So can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. So as we said, mermaids' purses are the egg cases of sharks, skates, and rays. And they're a really exciting discovery because they show us that those species are not only surviving the area, but they're also like thriving enough to breed. This gives us a really good insight into all the different species in the area, and that information can be used to make sure we're protecting them properly. So if we're finding a larger quantity of kind of rarer species in the area that we didn't know that they really were present, then we can make sure that the right kind of protections are in place to look after that species. The egg cases themselves are these kind of tough, leathery pouches. They're made of the same kind of thing that our hair and nails are made of. And the reason that these species lay them is so that they can kind of keep their egg case hooked onto the seaweed so that the young are born in a nice sheltered habitat rather than being washed out to sea where they'd have much lower chance of survival.
So tell us more about the species that we found. Are they all common to Cumbria?
Quite a few of them are. So the thornback ray, which we found quite a few of, is a fairly common skate species. It's really charismatic. It's one of the most commonly encountered skates in the UK because it lives in these quite shallow coastal waters and is therefore really commonly encountered by divers and snorkelers. And they're around 1 metre long. They've got these gorgeous thorns all the way down their back, which gives them their name. And they're just all around a really lovely, charismatic species. The spotted ray, which we found one egg case from, is much rarer. We don't tend to see them in the kind of near shore zone because they tend to live out in the offshore and just come close to shore to lay their eggs. But again, it's still a reasonably common species in the Irish Sea, and it's always an exciting find when we find their egg cases. The small spotted cat shark, which is the same species as the dogfish that Julia mentioned earlier that she found in a rock pool, is really common in the UK. It's a really, really lovely, like charismatic species. Divers quite often have really lovely interactions with them because they're just in those areas that we're in. And their egg cases are quite easily identifiable because they're that kind of lovely pale yellow. They're a fairly uniform size, and those tendrils that you get on the end are really distinctive. There's a couple of similar species that you might find in the UK, and especially in the Irish Sea. You might find egg cases a similar size and shape, but kind of tinged blue. And these are from the nurse hound, which is a slightly bigger cat shark, and it's much rarer. It's especially rare for it to be breeding in this area. So if you do find any blue tinged egg cases with kind of curly tendrils, then definitely let us know because that's a really exciting find.
Brilliant. So many of the species that you've just told us about are called rays, but it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? So what is the difference between a shark, a skate and a ray?
Yeah, so many of these species were called rays back before we sort of separated them out a bit more. So sharks, skates and rays are all elasmobranchs, which means that they have these elastic cartilaginous, so made of cartilage, skeletons, which are really flexible and allow them to swim really well. And there's like some really good differences between them. So the sharks are generally longer bodied. They've got a prominent dorsal fin and these kind of tooth-like scales, and you'll recognize them generally as a shark, as we have seen in all things. Skates and rays are often a bit harder to split up because they both have these kind of flat bodies and long tails. But there's a few key differences that we can use to make sure that we're identifying the right one. So skates are generally smaller. They've got slightly fleshier tails, whereas rays' tails are very thin and kind of whip-like. And skates also have smaller teeth. They're used for kind of biting, whereas a ray's teeth are sort of plate-like and they're used for crushing their prey. The rays are more kite-shaped, so they're kind of that really distinctive diamondy shape. And the other really important difference with the rays is that they give birth to live young. So you're not going to find any egg cases on the strandline from a ray because they don't lay eggs.
Okay, well, let's clear that one up.
Yeah.
So what else might we find from the strandline?
On the strandline, so there's all kinds of things we find, some of which we mentioned in the video, some of which we maybe didn't have time to go into. So you'll find things like cuttlebones, like we mentioned in the beachcombing video. You'll find whelk egg cases that Danny discussed, all different types of seaweed, and unfortunately, as we said, you will quite often find bits of marine litter. And these could come from really far away because of the ocean currents. They can be brought in from all over the world. Although because the Irish Sea is quite sheltered, also a lot of what we find washed up on our beaches comes from the habitats very close to us, and therefore give a really good insight into what's nearby.
Yeah, brilliant. So if people go out and they find things, is there any way that they can share their findings with us?
Absolutely. So there's some national survey projects like the Great Egg Case Hunt, which is a project run by the Shark Trust to help track where different shark and skate species, are breeding all around the country. So you can identify your egg cases there and log them with that. You can also send your photos to all our social media channels. We love hearing from you guys about what you've found. And you can also join the events we've started launching recently, which are called Coastal Explorers. And then there's kind of a Facebook group. You can all post pictures of what you're finding and share them with the community there. But of course, the best way to share all your findings and to share all the knowledge you might gain about this subject is to get your friends involved, go out doing a strandline search with some pals, and it really is a lovely way to spend an afternoon.
It definitely is. Now, we've only scratched the surface of all of the amazing wildlife which enjoys the Irish Sea, but there's a whole host that we might find out more in the open sea, who may have travelled from much further afield. So now we're going to have a quick taste of the far-ranging wildlife that you might spot.
Great to see that there's so many large and far-ranging species, as well as our lovely coastal ones in the area. Yeah. So let's start with the seabirds. Danny, why do they gather here in Cumbria?
Well, seabirds have to come to land because they need to lay an egg, and they can't do this in or on the sea, so they need land. So they'll be arriving around now, they'll be getting ready to breed, they'll be bonding with their pair, they'll be building nests, they'll be selecting their own little area that they're going to guard as their territory, before laying their eggs and raising these throughout the spring and early summer. So they'll have their eggs on the cliff, and then their chicks will hatch, and the parents will be really busy flying back and forth in the sea, collecting lots of fatty fish to fill their chicks up and make them really fat, so that when they're big enough, they have enough energy to jump.
So thanks for joining us again. Sorry we cut out there. Despite having 3 laptops with us, they all seem to have died, and that's just the fate of live events. But we just finished watching that gorgeous video about some of the different far-ranging wildlife in the Irish Sea, and we were just having a talk about some of the species that we find here. So Danny, let's start with the seabirds. Why do they gather in Cumbria?
So seabirds come here to breed, so they need to lay an egg and they need to do this on land. So they'll be arriving around now, they'll be getting ready to mate, they'll be meeting up with their partners, they'll be building their nest, and they'll be setting out a territory that they want to have as their breeding spot on a cliff. And then they'll lay their eggs and they'll start to raise their chicks once they're hatched, so they'll make several trips back from the ocean with lots of beaks or stomachs full of fish, which they'll feed to their chick and make them lovely and fat, so that when it's time for them to jump off the cliff and go on their ocean lives, they have lots of energy and fat stores. So the cliffs between St Bees and Whitehaven are really important. So they support around 10,000 breeding birds, and they're the northwest of England's only site for cliff nesting seabirds. So really important.
That's amazing. So why do they gather in such big colonies?
Well, the cliffs are really important as they provide some protection from predators, so it's a bit harder for things like foxes and rats to access them on a cliff. There's also a little bit of safety in numbers, so if there's lots of eggs around you, your individual egg is less likely to get picked by a predator. But more than that, they're really great information exchanges. So the seabirds will learn from each other, so they might learn how best to raise a chick or where the best spots to fish are from each other. And they'll be exchanging all this information between them.
That's amazing. What about some of that larger wildlife? We saw things like whales, basking sharks, leatherback turtles, sunfish.
Yeah.
Why do they come to our seas?
So many of these will gather to take advantage of areas that are really rich in food. So we'll get things which are called a phytoplankton bloom. And these are the very basis of the food chain. And where these areas have these big blooms of food, they'll attract lots of things to them. So you'll get basking sharks which come to filter out all of that food in gulps full of water. And then the sunfish will come to feed on the jellyfish that are attracted to the plankton as well. And the dolphins will come to feed on the fish that are attracted. And then the seabirds will also come and pick everything off the top. So they're really amazing places where you get the huge hotspots for biodiversity.
That's incredible. So we've talked about some of the dolphin species that kind of come in to catch all that food while it's there. Do we have any species that stick around for the whole year? Any resident pods?
Yeah, so we have some species which do stay around for a bit longer. So we know in Cardigan Bay there's a resident population of bottlenose dolphins, and then on the northwest of Scotland there's a pod of orcas which are resident there as well. There's also a resident pod of Risso's dolphins which like to hang about the Isle of Man as well. And it's not necessarily determined by species, whether they're resident or transitory. They basically pick depending on a number of factors such as their family or pod, the type of prey they prefer, and the size of their group. So they'll choose where they want to be. And you also get what is known as superpods. So often bottlenose dolphin pods will join together and you'll get huge pods of thousands of individual dolphins, and they can travel enormous distances, so they're a really great sight to see.
That sounds amazing. And speaking of marine mammals, we cannot go through a whole marine event without talking about our gorgeous grey seals at South Walney. So how have they been this winter? Have they had a good year?
Yeah, so South Walney is the only colony of seals in northwest England. And our colony this year has done fantastically well. So we've had a record year with over 518 seals recorded. So this is 5 times the numbers that we saw in 2010 and 25 times the numbers that we saw when we first started monitoring. We've also had 5 beautiful pups that were born this season and were raised in the colony. And while we're doing our surveys, we saw over 300 seals hauled out onto the beach. Now, we don't monitor the seals during the spring and summer period because there's a really important colony of lesser blackback gulls which are breeding nearby the seal colony. So if we went to do the seal surveys, then we'd also disturb the seagulls. So we don't want to do that. So we'll leave them be for the summer, but we're really excited to visit them during winter again next year.
We certainly are. And if people want to see the seals for themselves, go out and get some wildlife spotting, what can they do?
Well, seals are really vulnerable to disturbance, so you don't want to get too close. And it's really important because if you frighten them, they can stampede into the sea, which both disturbs them, can distress them, uses up vital energy stores, and it can mean that pups could get trampled in all of that big rush as well. So you can't go and see them at South Walney very close, but you can see them very close if you go onto our website and search for the seal camera. So there's a live seal camera which is running where you can watch all the fantastic activity that's happening. So you'll see seals resting, you'll see them playing, mating, you might even see a pup if you're lucky. And then if you go to reserve, you can go to what we call our seal hide and have a look at the seals there a bit further so that you're a safe distance so that you're not disturbing them.
It really is a very cute sight seeing them playing out in the bay, so we'd highly recommend that. Thank you for joining us on this event. As we said, sorry for a few of the technical issues, but we hope you really enjoyed it. We hope we inspired you to go out and explore some of the